Hatchet Chapter 10. He could not at first leave the fire. It was so precious to him, so close and sweet a thing, the yellow and red flames brightening the dark interior of the shelter, the happy crackle of the dry wood as it burned, that he thought he could not leave it. He went to the trees and brought as many dead limbs as he could chop off and carry. When he had a large pile of them, he sat near the fire, though it was getting warm in the middle part of the day. He was hot, and broke them into small pieces, and fed the fire. "I will not let you go out," he said to himself, to the flames, "not ever." And so he sat through a long part of the day, keeping the flames even, eating from his stockpile of raspberries, and leaving to drink from the lake when he was thirsty. In the afternoon, towards evening, with his face smoke smeared and his skin red from the heat, he finally began to think about what he needed to do. Sorry about that. He would need a large wood pile to get through that night. It would be almost impossible to find wood in the dark, so he had to have it all in and cut and stacked before the sun went down. Brian made certain the fire was banked with new wood, then went out to the shelter and searched for a happy fuel supply. Up the hill from the campsite, the same windstorm that had left him a piece of land. Up the hill from the campsite, the same windstorm that had left him a place to land the plane. He had only been there 3-4 days ago, had dropped 3 large wood pines across each other, and they were dead now, dry and filled with weathered, dry limbs, enough for many days. He chopped and broke and carried the wood back to the camp, stacking the pieces under the overhang until he had what he thought to be an enormous pile, as high as his head and 6 feet across the base. Between the trips, he added small pieces to the fire to keep it going, and on one of the trips to get wood, he noticed an added advantage of the fire. When he was in the shade of the trees breaking limbs, the mosquitoes swarmed on him, as usual, but when he came to the fire or near the shelter where the smoke eddied and swirled, the insects were gone. It was a wonderful discovery. The mosquitoes had nearly driven him mad, and the thought of getting rid of them lifted his spirits. On another trip, he looked back and saw the smoke curling up through the trees, and realized for the first time he now had a means to make a signal. He could carry a burning stick and build a signal fire on top of the rock, make clouds of smoke, and perhaps attract attention, which meant more wood, still more wood. There did not seem to be an end to the wood he would need, and he spent all the rest of his afternoon in the dusk making wood trips. At dark, he settled in for the night, and next to the fire with a stack of short pieces ready to put on, he ate the rest of his raspberries. During all the work of the day, his leg had loosened, but it still ached a bit, and he rubbed it and watched the fire and thought for the first time since the crash he might be getting a handle on things, might be able to start doing something other than just sit. He was out of food, but he could look tomorrow and could build a signal fire tomorrow and get more wood tomorrow. The fire cut the night coolness and settled him back to sleep, thinking of tomorrow. He had slept hard and wasn't sure what awakened him, but his eyes came open and he stared into the darkness. The fire had burned down and looked out, but he stirred with a piece of wood and found a bed of coals still growing red and hot. With small pieces of wood and careful blowing, he soon had a blaze going again. It had been close. He would have to make sure to try and sleep in short intervals so that he would keep the fire going, and he tried to think of a way to regulate his sleep, but it made him so sleepy to think about, and he was just going under again when he heard something outside. It was not unlike the sound of the porcupine, something slithering and being dragged across the sand. But when he looked at the door opening, it was too dark to see anything. Whatever it was, it stopped making that sound. In a few moments, he thought he heard something sloshing into the water at the shoreline. But he had the fire now and plenty of wood, so he wasn't worried as he had been the night before. He dozed, slept for a time, awakened again just at the gray dawn of light, and added wood to the still smoking fire before standing outside and stretching. Standing with the arms stretched over his head, the tight knot of hunger in his stomach, and he looked towards the lake and saw the tracks. They were strange. A main center line up from the lake in the sand with claw marks on each side, leading to a small pile of sand, and then going back down to the water. He walked over to them, squatted near them, and studied them, and tried to make sense of them. Whatever had made the tracks had some kind of flat, dragging bottom in the middle, and it was apparent that they were being pushed by legs that were stuck out to the side. Up from the water in a small pile of sand, up from the water to a small pile of sand, then back down into the water. Some animal, some kind of water animal that came up the sand to do what? To do something with the sand. Make a pile of sand? He smiled. City boy, he thought. Oh, you city boy and your city ways. He made a mirror in his mind, a mirror of himself, and saw how he must look. City boy with your city ways, sitting in the sand, trying to read the tracks and not knowing, not understanding. Why would something wild come up from the water to play in the sand? Not that way. Animals weren't that way. They didn't waste time that way. It had come up from the water for a reason, a good reason, and he must try to understand the reason. He changed to fully understanding the reason, or he would not make it. He had come up from the water for a reason, and that reason, he thought, squatting, the reason had to have something to do with the pile of sand. He brushed the top off gently with his hand, but found only damp sand. Still, there must be some reason, and it must have something to do with scraping and digging until about 4 inches down, he suddenly came across a small chamber in the cool, damp sand. They're like eggs, mini eggs, almost perfectly round eggs, the size of tennis balls. He laughed, and because he knew it had been a turtle. He had seen a show on television about sea turtles, and that they came onto the beaches and laid their eggs in sand. There must be a fresh lake. There must be freshwater lake turtles that did the same. Maybe snapping turtles. He had heard of snapping turtles. They became fairly large. He thought it must have been a snapper that came up in the night when he heard the noise that awakened him. She must have come to lay the eggs. Food. More than eggs, more than the knowledge, more than anything, this was food. His stomach tightened and he rolled, and the noise and made noise as he looked at the eggs. As if his stomach belonged to someone else or had seen the eggs with his own eyes. He was demanding food. The hunger, always there. He had been somewhat controlled and dormant when there was nothing to eat. But with the eggs came the scream to eat. His whole body craved food with such intensity that it quickened his breath. He reached into the nest and pulled the eggs out one at a time. There were 17 of them, each as round as a ball and white. They had leathery shells and gave instead of breaking when he squeezed them. When he had them heaped on the sand in a pyramid, he had never felt so rich somehow. He suddenly realized he did not know how to eat them. He had the fire, but no way to cook them, no container. And he never thought of eating a raw egg. He had an uncle named Carter, his father's brother, who had put eggs in a glass of milk and then drank it in the morning. Brian had watched him do it just once, and when the running part of the white left the glass and went into his uncle's mouth, and down his throat. In a single gulp, Brian had almost lost everything he'd ever eaten. Still, he thought, his stomach moved through his backbone, and he became less and less fussy. Some natives in the world ate grasshoppers and ants, and if they could do that, then he could get a raw egg down. He picked one up, tried to break the shell, and found it surprisingly tough. Finally, though, using the hatchet and sharpened with a stick, he poked a hole in the egg and widened the hole with his finger and looked inside. It was just an egg. It had dark yellow yolk, and it was not as much white as he thought there would be. Just an egg, food. He had an egg to eat, raw. He looked across the lake and brought the egg to his mouth and closed his eyes and sucked and squeezed at the same time and swallowed as fast as he could. Ugh! It had a greasy, almost oily taste, but it was still an egg. His throat tried to throw it back up. His whole body seemed to convulse with it, but his stomach took it, held it, and demanded more. The second egg was easier, and the third one he had no trouble at all. It just slid down. He ate 6 of them. Could hardly have eaten them all could have easily eaten them all had he not been full, but a part of him said, "Hold back and save the rest." He could not believe his hunger. The eggs had awakened in him, roaring so that it tore at him. After the 6th egg, he ripped open the shell and licked it inside clean. Then he went back and ripped the other 5 open and licked them as well. He wondered if he could eat the shells. There must be some food value in them, but when he tried, they were too leathery to chew and he couldn't get them down. He stood away from the eggs for a moment, literally stood, and turned them away so he could not eat them. If he looked at them, he would have to eat more. He would store them in the shelter and eat them only one a day. He fought the hunger down again, controlled it. He would take them now and store them and save them and eat them one a day, and realized, as he thought it, that it might. He would take them down and store them and save them and eat one a day, and he realized, as he thought, that that he had forgotten that they might come, the searchers. Surely they would have come before he could eat all the eggs in one day. He had forgotten to think about them. That wasn't good. He had to keep thinking of them, because if he forgot them and did not think of them, they might forget about him. And he had to keep hoping. He had to keep hoping.